A PSP sits on a table, screen black, completely dead. Someone slides a battery out of it, sets it aside, picks up a second battery, identical, slots it in. Nothing happens for a moment. Then the green light comes on. The screen wakes, not to the Sony logo, not to the XMB home menu, to something else, a raw text interface, white characters on black, loading from a memory card, running code that Sony never wrote and never authorized, on a machine that Sony's own engineers had declared, in every technical sense, dead. No one in the room says anything. There is nothing to say. What just happened does not have a clean explanation yet. All you know is that a corpse just sat up. What you just watched is the ending of a 6-year war between a multinational corporation and a group of anonymous strangers, a war Sony fought with firmware updates, legal threats, and hardware revisions, a war the strangers fought with free evenings, cheap tools, and one ordinary battery that turned out to be a master key. This is how they built it. This is how they found the door, and this is why Sony, one of the most sophisticated consumer electronics companies ever built, never had a chance of keeping it closed. Stick with me to the end and you'll see exactly how it fell apart. As always, every source for this story is in the description. If you're into stories like this, subscribe, drop a like, and tell me your thoughts below. December 2004. Sony ships the PlayStation Portable into the world, and they are confident. They have reason to be. The PSP is extraordinary hardware for its era. A 333 MHz processor, 32 megabytes of RAM, a 4.3-inch screen that makes every other handheld on the market look like a toy, Wi-Fi, a custom disk format, the UMD that Sony controls from manufacture to shelf, and a security architecture built from the ground up to keep it that way. Every piece of software that runs on this machine must be cryptographically signed by Sony. No signature, no execution. The file system is hidden. The bootloader is encrypted. The signing keys belong to Sony and Sony alone. By the time the PSP reaches North America in March 2005, Sony has moved 500,000 units in 2 days, $150 million in first-week retail, a product they believe is sealed. The people who break things for a living see something different. They see a small, locked computer, and within a month of launch, one of them will find a way in. Not through the security Sony built, but through a racing game Sony shipped themselves. The first crack does not come from a genius with a soldering iron. It comes from a racing game. Wipeout Pure ships with a download feature, a stripped-down web browser built for exactly one purpose, fetching new content from Sony's servers. Point it at Sony's address? It goes there. Locked. A hacker named Jonathan Terlesky notices something. The PSP doesn't go directly to Sony's server. First, it asks a DNS resolver where Sony lives, then it goes to that address. So what if you lie to the resolver? He runs his own DNS server. When his PSP asks where Sony lives, his machine sends it somewhere else. The walled garden opens. Developers build custom portals, chat rooms, message boards, live IRC networks, all running through a feature Sony never intended anyone to use this way. Nobody is running illegal code, but the principle is established. The machine can be lied to. Now the scene goes deeper. A hacker named Nem uses what the Wipeout browser exposes about the UMD file structure to reverse engineer the PSP's executable format. Within weeks, a Spanish developer named Killer X discovers something that will define the next year of the war. Firmware 1.50 verifies software by checking how it's organized into folders. Killer X discovers that if you split a program across 2 folders, one named to look legitimate, one holding the actual code, the firmware checks the respectable folder, decides everything is fine, and runs the other one. They call it K-exploit. It is the digital equivalent of walking into a guarded building behind someone in a suit. The guard checks the suit, not the person wearing it. Overnight, firmware 1.50 becomes the most valuable thing in the scene. Anyone running it can run anything. Homebrew games, emulators, media players, a portable library of every old console ever made. Sony shipped a fortress. The internet found the side door in a month. Sony patches new firmware. The K-exploit door closes. Their next mistake doesn't look like a mistake at all. It looks like a feature. In the process of making the PSP a better multimedia device, they add support for additional image file types, TIFF images, photographs, innocent, harmless photographs. Except the image processing code has a weakness. When the PSP loads a picture, it reads the file header to learn the image dimensions and allocates exactly that much memory. But it doesn't verify that the actual data matches what the header claimed. So the scene builds a photograph that lies. A TIFF file crafted byte by byte, declaring one size in its header but carrying far more data than declared. When the PSP loads it, the image data floods past its memory boundary and spills into the region that controls what the processor does next. Hiding in that flood, code. You open a photograph. The photograph takes over the machine. A picture of a sunset, a wallpaper, anything at all, opens in the image viewer, and the processor, expecting to draw pixels on a screen, instead finds itself executing instructions written by a stranger. The scene uses this opening to do the most useful thing possible. They use the photograph to trick the PSP into downgrading itself, rolling the firmware back to version 1.50, back to the Holy Grail. Sony locks the front door. The scene climbs in through a photograph and unlocks it from the inside. Grand Theft Auto Liberty Cities. A massive game. And like all games, it saves your progress, writing a small data file to the memory card, then reading it back when you load. A developer in the scene looks at how the game reads that save back. The game trusts the save completely. It reads it without checking. It assumes the data it wrote is the data it's reading back. So, the scene builds a save file that isn't a save file, a Trojan horse. You load your game, the reader swallows the payload, and the machine is yours. What makes this one elegant is what it doesn't attack. It doesn't touch Sony's software at all. It hides inside Rockstar's game, territory Sony doesn't fully control. Sony cannot patch a disk already sitting in a million homes. So, Sony does something almost unheard of. It halts production, re-engineers the disk, patches the save handler, represses it. Stores fill with new copies, and the original dangerous copies of a Grand Theft Auto game become collector's items, hunted on the secondary market, traded like contraband. The corporation had been forced to recall physical reality to plug a hole in a save file. But all of this, the photographs, the save files, the folder tricks, shared one fatal weakness. Every single one required the firmware to be alive, and what was coming next didn't need the firmware at all. What was coming didn't care if the machine was dead. The year is 2006. A name starts appearing in the scene. Dark Alex. What is confirmed about him? He is Spanish. His first name is Alejandro. The alias is a direct translation. He is from Girona. He is a student. He prefers goth aesthetics, manga, and cats. That is nearly everything publicly on record. What is not rumor is what he does. While everyone else is finding doors, Dark Alex decides to rebuild the house. He takes Sony's official firmware, the latest, most secure version, and decrypts it, pulls it apart module by module, reads its logic. Sony releases a major firmware update, the product of a large, well-funded team. New walls, new locks. Dark Alex cracks it open and releases a working custom version in days. Not weeks, days. 12 walls. 12 times they come down, on the schedule of one person's free evenings. Then he doesn't exploit it. He rewrites it. He builds a hybrid, an operating system that looks like Sony's on the surface, running all the newest official games, but with every lock stripped out from the inside and the doors left standing. For the first time, you don't have to choose between new games and total control of your own machine. And he builds a recovery menu, a low-level safe mode summoned by holding a shoulder button on boot, a low-level safe mode from which you could repair a half-dead console before it fully died. He isn't just breaking the machine, he is engineering it better than the people who made it. July 2007. Dark Alex posts a message. He's done. He cites problems with Sony. He is leaving the scene. The community is shaken. Some assume Sony paid him off. Sony denies it. And then, almost immediately, something else appears. A team, unknown, presenting as Russian developers. Fast, technically excellent. Within weeks, Team M33 releases 3.51 M33, a full custom firmware on Sony's newest update. The scene is relieved. Nobody asks too many questions. In their first public interview, speaking as a Russian team, they say, when Sony understands the uselessness of their attempts to fight against custom firmware, they will release firmware that allows homebrew. But even as Dark Alex fought alone under a false name, something else was being built. Not by one person, by 13. And what they were building had nothing to do with firmware at all. In September 2007, Dark Alex reveals the truth. He is Team M33. He has been Team M33 since the moment he announced his retirement. He built the Russian cover deliberately, exploiting a legal gray area in Russian copyright law to create distance between himself and his work. He had not retired. He had put on a mask. And while Sony believed their most dangerous adversary had walked away, he was still there, still working, still watching. 13 people, the biggest names of PSP hacking, operating under a collective they call C+D, Create and Destroy. Nem, Joke, Fangita, Dark Alex himself, Mathiel, Tyrannid, Adrahil, Booster, and 6 others. They are building something that has never been built, an exploit that doesn't attack the firmware, doesn't need a software vulnerability, doesn't care what version Sony shipped last week. They have been working on it, quietly, since late 2006. Their plan? Hold it. Wait until the PSP Slim hits stores. That way, even the new hardware won't have time to be hardened before launch. The damage would land on both generations at once. They agree on one rule: no leaks. Someone leaked. The exploit surfaces on the black market. Someone inside the circle sold it. Real money is changing hands for a tool that was never supposed to be sold. So the team makes a decision. They publish it, immediately, for free. Their release statement reads, "Although the time was not right, our hand has been forced. If you have paid for an unbricker, you have been ripped off. Blame whoever it was that leaked or stole it." Return to that battery. To understand what the Prometheus project built, you need to understand the first half second of a PSP's life. When you press the power button, the main processor is not the first thing to stir. The first thing to wake is a small, separate chip, SYSCON, the System Control Microcontroller. Its job, manage power, check that everything is in order, and only then tell the rest of the machine to begin booting. And one of the first things SYSCON does is talk to the battery. The battery is not a dumb cell. Inside every PSP battery is a small EEPROM chip, a memory chip, holding a serial number, an identity. SYSCON reads it, confirms the battery is genuine, and only then allows the boot process to continue. Now, Sony's factory engineers needed a way to service machines on the assembly line, flash firmware onto units, test hardware, repair broken consoles before they shipped. So they burned something into SYSCON, not in firmware, not in software, in silicone, permanent, unchangeable from the outside. If SYSCON reads a specific, impossible value from the battery, all ones, a value no production battery would ever carry, it does not boot the console normally. It drops into a hidden diagnostic mode, service mode. And in service mode, it completely ignores the internal NAND memory, the firmware, everything Sony ever patched, and instead reaches for the removable memory card and runs whatever it finds there. The scene found this, and they understood immediately what they were holding. Picture a bank vault. Sony has spent years building this. Cryptographic signatures on every piece of software, an encrypted bootloader, 60 firmware updates, each one sealing a window the scene had opened. But the building has a fire alarm. And the building's oldest, most unchangeable wiring says when the fire alarm is pulled, the main vault seals, but a service entrance opens for the fire department. No questions asked. The scene doesn't pick the lock. They pull the fire alarm. They modify a battery so its EEPROM broadcasts that impossible value, the fire alarm. They prepare a memory card to be the magic memory stick. The service mode instructions are not in the firmware. They are not software. They are physically burned into SYSCON at the moment of manufacture, frozen, permanent, beyond the reach of any update. On every PSP 1000 and early PSP 2000 already sold, the back door is permanent, welded into hardware. Nothing Sony can ship over the internet will ever change it. With one modified battery, every one of Sony's 60 software updates, years of engineering, years of patches, years of firmware releases, becomes instantly, completely irrelevant. Now pull back, because the Pandora battery is the ending of the war, but it is not the most interesting thing about it. The most interesting thing is how Sony lost. Sony had engineers, hundreds of them, talented, well-resourced, operating inside one of the most sophisticated electronics companies ever built. They released 12 firmware updates in 2 years. They patched image exploits, save file exploits, folder exploits. They changed the physical hardware. They repressed game disks. They updated battery protection in new units. They did everything they knew how to do. And they lost, not because they were incompetent. They lost because the thing that defeated them was not something they had failed to secure. It was something they had intentionally built. The service mode was not a vulnerability. It was a feature designed for Sony's own factory floor, a legitimate, necessary tool burned into silicon because that was the most reliable place to put it. Somewhere in 2004, a decision was made for convenience, for practicality, for the entirely reasonable need to service units on an assembly line. That decision lost the war. Every wall Sony built afterward defended a door that was already standing open inside every machine that left the factory. 60 software updates on one side, one factory decision on the other. The decision wins. 4 days after Pandora's battery releases, a man named David Court posts a message. In the PSP scene, he is known as Fungita. He is not a teenager. He is a professional programmer in his 30s. He writes server software for telecoms companies. He practices martial arts. He spends an hour a night on his PSP, and he was one of the 13 people who built Pandora. He writes, "It's with much regret that I'm going to retire from the sharp end of the PSP homebrew scene. The betrayal of trust that preceded the Pandora release was extremely hurtful and has left me unable to fully trust the people I'd previously enjoyed working with. Long gone are the fun days of pioneering amongst like minds. The Pandora battery marks my last major PSP project." Someone inside the circle sold the Prometheus project before the team was ready. The betrayal forced their hand and destroyed something that couldn't be rebuilt. Pandora's battery is the greatest achievement in the history of PSP hacking, and on the day it releases, the team that built it fractures. One of its architects walks away and never comes back. Victory in the PSP war tasted like this. Dark Alex keeps going under the Team M23 mask through 2008 and into 2009, but something is coming that makes everything we've just covered, every exploit, every patch, every battery, look like a warm-up act. Dark Alex continues as Team M23 through 2008 and into 2009. His last act, a small bug fix for firmware 5.00 M23.6, released as a standalone specifically to avoid issuing version 7, which would have been a clean final release. He stops one update short of closure. Then his forums go dark. His site goes silent. Rumors circulate. Sony hired him. He's in prison. He's dead. The most likely answer is the least dramatic one. He was young. He walked away. He took his real surname with him. Sony, meanwhile, finally learns the lesson. On the PSP Slim's later motherboards and on the PSP 3000 that follows, they rebuild the boot process so the battery trick no longer works. The impossible serial still triggers service mode, but the machine now demands a second secret the scene doesn't have, and refuses to boot without it. For the first time in the entire war, Sony ships hardware the Pandora battery cannot open. They won the hardware battle. They were about to lose the war anyway. 2011. A different hacker, a different console. George Hotz, known as GeoHot, while working on the PlayStation 3, finds something that ends the entire story: the root signing keys. Not a firmware exploit, not a battery modification, not a corrupted save file. The actual cryptographic master keys Sony uses to sign every piece of software across their platforms, including the PSP. Every PSP, every firmware version, no special hardware, no modified battery, no cursed image file. Sign your code with the leaked keys and the machine runs it, because at its deepest level it was told to trust those keys, and now everyone has them. Sony sued GeoHot. The lawsuit settled. He signed a permanent injunction, agreeing never to touch a Sony product again. The keys were already public. The damage was already permanent. Sony's own cryptographic signature had become the master key that opened everything. Now we stop. 13 people built this. One was a student from Verona who could crack a firmware update in a weekend. One was a telecoms engineer from Edinburgh who spent an hour a night on his PSP and walked away when someone he trusted sold their secret for cash. The rest are still anonymous. Most of them you will never know. They had no funding, no legal team, no office, no plan beyond the next firmware update. They had free evenings, cheap hardware, and the belief that a machine you purchase should answer to you. The battery that did all of this weighs less than 100 grams. It fits in your palm. It has a Sony logo on one face and a row of copper contacts on the other. Inside it, a small chip holds a value. On every normal battery, that value is a serial number, meaningless to anything except a warranty database. On this one, it is all ones. And somewhere in a factory in 2004, a Sony engineer burned an instruction into a chip that says, if you see this value, open the service door, no questions asked. They burned it there because they needed it there, because they couldn't imagine that anyone outside their factory would ever know to look for it. They burned it there and forgot it was sitting in the lock. Sony spent 6 years and hundreds of millions of dollars defending a fortress. They lost it to a battery.